Well, photography has taken me all over Canada really, and in other places like Mexico in particular, where I've done a lot of work with migrant farm workers, in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, in Cuba. You know, one of the reasons I like my work a lot is because I end up meeting lots of interesting people. But sometimes if you don't speak the language, then it's a lot harder, and you have to find ways of you know, through body language, through eye contact, through simple phrases, through gestures that you do. And I find that when you try and speak somebody else's language, people are usually so pleased with that, so delighted, that all kinds of barriers just seem to wash off.
What I find specifically in Vincenzo Pietropaolo's work is his ability to take a common moment or something that we're all familiar with and give it just that extra element of strangeness. But he also catches things that seem slightly off camera. They seem like the thing that's happening slightly at the edges of things, so that you have this sense of really capturing a real moment and of capturing a real person.
A great photograph, or it happens sometimes when there's a rapport, a moment between two people, and one of them happens to have a camera and records that moment, you know.
It does strike me that photography is perhaps a more intuitive art than, say, writing. With a photograph, you have that one instant to get it right, and then the instant is gone forever.
Artists today are not satisfied with the textbook version of history. They are interrogating history and finding new ways, new expressions to deal with history from their own personal perspectives, as we see in Vincenzo's work, for example.
Photography is really a very solitary activity, because you spend quite a bit of time either behind the camera looking at people, looking at the world, you know, through a little window, or you spend time in the darkroom. For me, the most important moment in photography occurs when I release the shutter. Sometimes I end up taking, you know, many pictures, but each picture that you take is important because it leads to the next one. You know, a good photographer composes in the camera, not afterwards. I became interested in cameras when I discovered a darkroom at the school where I was going, Harvard Collegiate, and I fell in love with the magic of the darkroom and the magic of the camera. You know, I was looking at lots of photography magazines and trying to get ideas what to photograph, and I remember someone had said to me in a conversation that I should really try and photograph my own family or my own community. My grandmother, who came to Canada when she was well in her 70s, because all her family by then had left Italy, and they had gone either to Argentina or to Canada. And when she arrived in Toronto, she hadn't gone anywhere in her life. My father always said to me that you traveled for two reasons. One is you traveled to get drafted into the army, or you traveled in order to immigrate, to leave. So you traveled and you left for good. And so she was, after my grandfather, you know, her husband died, she was left all alone, and I started photographing her. She was the first person, in a sense, that I photographed extensively. The camera was, in a sense, it was like keeping a journal, you know? It was like a visual journal. Instead of writing what was happening to me every day, I was photographing my experiences. And then I branched out to the community of College Street, and then to the place where people worked. So it was Spadina Avenue for the women, and it was downtown Toronto for the men. This is where the building boom was, along Bay Street and Bloor Street and Queen Street and Front and King and so on. All these big, large bank towers and office towers, they were all built in the 70s. one of the things that I learned very early on was when people refused me permission to come inside the factories to take pictures, I was wondering why are they afraid of this camera? And I think they knew, you know, something which I hadn't realized yet. I was quite young, that the camera is a powerful, powerful witness. The employees were, they were all very, very happy to see me. Once they saw me with the camera, they were, you know, they were very excited, and they were astonished that somebody would take pictures of them.
Because when he started doing this photograph in the 1970s, he photographed his community with lack of sentimentality and with great objectivity.
None of the people in the pictures were, you know, either famous architects or famous lawyers or famous artists or whatever, but they were just working people. And I remember that publishers just were not interested in this kind of stuff at all.
I first met Vincenzo, it must be almost 10 years ago. He came to us, and believe it or not, at that time, it was the body of work that became Not Paved with Gold just this past year that he was showing us. He had already presented it to another publisher, and as years went by, Vince found a way to free it up and bring it to us. We have always been prepared to publish books that we recognize as having cultural and political and social value, even if we're taking quite a great risk in terms of their marketability. He is both an artist and a worker in a very profound sense.
My father, you know, he was also a construction worker, so it was natural for me to come and photograph construction workers because I knew what the stuff that they were interested in. I knew what to talk about with them. Most of them were people who came from rural areas, and they hadn't worked in factories before anyways, and they were just trained. Everybody was very willing to learn quickly for the safety and comfort of having a job.
Guardava che l'altra gente, come quell'altro cemento finisce come facevano, e dopo un anno fatto pure il cemento finisce. Yeah, the work at the construction, I make money. The work at the farm, not giving money, nothing.
Well, it wasn't just my parents. It was the entire community. You were exposed to the idea of hard work. You had to be independent. Then I realized there were lots of people who were working in very bad conditions, and they didn't complain because they were afraid of losing their job. You know, all these, you know, construction projects that I was photographing. Well, sometimes people did get hurt on the job, and sometimes people actually, you know, died.
This is an aspect of social history and economic history that can so easily be hidden. So if you go downtown in Toronto in the financial district, or you know, to any of the huge malls and all these enormous capital projects, there's no explicit sign indicating whose labor actually created all of these things.
The fact that I could speak the language, that I could identify with them on such an intimate level, with not only the language but even the dialect, because I could understand if they were speaking Calabrian or Sicilian, for example, which many of them were. As soon as I opened my mouth and I would say a few words in Italian, it's like all these barriers would just tumble down.
As you say, things that at one point seem irrelevant and minor because there's nobody famous or there's nothing that sticks out. In the fullness of time, you begin to see the moments that were important. They begin to stick out in a different kind of way. And through much of the time that Little Italy existed, that particular Little Italy, it was really considered as a kind of ghetto outside of the mainstream of Canadian life, and people didn't go there. They didn't go there for espresso the way they do now.
we belong in this picture too. Like this is my parents in the cover of the book.
The cover photo where this older couple is looking at me and I'm looking at them, and there's a kind of communication between us.
We saw this picture many years ago. I don't recall the date exactly, in the 70s.
He, the older gentleman, is really very trusting of me. But I think she's also being very protective of him, in the sense that she's holding on to him, you know?
Somebody came into the hall and said to me, "Lydia, your parents are in the newspaper." It was right in the front page. I used to be a cutter. I was cutting with big cutting knives and garment factory.
Right behind me there's a building which used to be a sock factory, and which is it was the last remaining of the garment factories. Now back in the 1970s, you have to realize that pretty well all the buildings on Spadina Avenue were garment factories.
I knew how to sew and cut a little bit for myself. I was young, they taught me, and I learned fast.
I remember seeing these rows and rows and rows of sewing machines, and women sitting at their desks, you know, sewing or sorting socks or cutting material or whatever.
We had to work, you know, you have to make a living. You don't come here and have money. You have to work for your living, you know.
In a sense, these were the sweatshops of the day. These were the sweatshops of the 1960s and 1970s.
But at the age of 38, I had an angina, heart attack. And thanks to her, that she was very strong.
We managed.
She had a lot of wills to go on.
In those days, the working conditions weren't very good. And in fact, there were a lot of problems that people had with trying to make claims in the workers' compensation back then. There were problems with injuries on the job.
We asked for help to the government when I had the heart attack, because we just bought the house a year earlier, 1971. Yeah. And 1972, we asked for help. In those days, they only give me $5 of pills, and that's it. You're on your own.
So that gave the impetus to the Italian community to organize itself and to form, you know, to demand changes in labor legislation.
But those two old people, they did a lot for us.
They raised my kids so I could go to work.
We had a major problem in the 70s because many of our girls, or most of our men, were married very young in life. The girls are married at 16, 17, 18, the guys at 22, 24, 26.
Okay, this is a picture of my wedding day, 1973. Vince was my official photographer.
We used to have dances here in the hall of this church in the early 70s during school time, so they could kind of, you know, get used to being next to the opposite sex, next to boys and girls, like to teach them that they didn't have to marry who their mother wanted them to marry.
The only two things I remember are washing the car and my rented dress, and everything else is kind of flurry of just trying to get it over with. It was such a stressful day. The picture was taken in my parents' backyard in Etobicoke under a pear tree. He took a great picture of my father. He looked incredibly angry, and in fact, we weren't speaking when he walked me up the aisle. We hadn't been speaking for a year.
We didn't have a high divorce rate. We had a high rate of unhappy marriages, because now these young couples realize it was much more to life at 18 and 19 than being at home all day long, having a baby home when you're home from work, to cook for your husband, and they were 18 years old.
women really had, you know, they had two jobs. I mean, two full-time jobs. They worked in the daytime in the factories, and then in the evenings they ran the household, which was their traditional job.
I mean, how can you be powerful from the kitchen, which is the boundaries for most Italian women in that era?
The people they were working with, especially the Canadian people, were going out to a restaurant, were going out after work to have a beer, were going out after work to socialize, and these people had to go right home to take care of their families.
I was very estranged from my family at that point because my parents tried to keep me in a prison of this house, and I left home and I met someone, I fell in love with him and moved back, and I thought the easiest thing to do was to get married. My parents didn't let me date, they didn't let me go out, so getting married seemed to be a good solution.
It was a major problem for us because very often the person they married at 16, they didn't love at 22.
I mean, it was a real wedding. I loved my husband and so on, but it was a bit forced because I felt like I didn't have a choice. The choice was stay at home in prison or get married and have a life. And it was the 70s, a very exciting time in Toronto. The hippie movement was happening, counterculture was alive, but I wasn't allowed to take part in it. As an Italian daughter, I couldn't take part in it, and I wanted to.
We used to have dances here in the hall of this church in the early 70s because the girls were basically not allowed to leave the verandas of their homes when they went home.
We are on Grace Street near College, which is the old Little Italy, the heart of Little Italy in Toronto. And this is really where I grew up. I went to school nearby. I actually lived in the street for a brief time when we first moved to Canada. When we first arrived in Canada, we lived on Grace Street.
And the Italians started to buy these houses from the Irish and the Jewish population. So much so that by 1950, the Jewish population and the Irish population had moved away, and it was mainly Italian.
And also, it's a very important street for me because I have taken many of my pictures right in the street, in front of St. Francis of Assisi Church.
In 1968, the Italians were given the option to come up to St. Francis Parish and give the parish of St. Agnes to the Portuguese community, which they did. In 1970, the official move was made. St. Francis became the Italian parish of the area.
Growing up Catholic, I knew all the, all the rituals. It was very familiar to me. It was very familiar territory.
The church was, a central part of our life. It was where everybody went, and it was like a comfort zone for everybody. Everybody met there, and we all gathered there. And I was an altar boy as a kid. And
I think it was a place that women could go safely. They could leave the house and go out to church. That was acceptable, and that's where they went.
And I started taking pictures really during the religious processions that they had for all these years.
There's a huge procession that they get, probably about, 50,000 people show up to that. And that's very traditional. Even to this day, the Good Friday is something that we always show up. As a family, we always go down.
It was also a time when I suppose there really weren't that many cameras. And so camera was still a bit of a novelty.
Another thing I noticed, looking at these pictures, back memories, if you notice, the children are always well dressed.
But I distinctly remember that suit, actually. This was apparently 1971 is when Vincenzo took the picture.
The Italians have a word sometimes, the northern Italian Jews, called I fiori. Our flowers, not our children, not I figli, I fiori. The children are their flowers.
I started photographing them because, in a sense, it was an easy way to start photography, to photograph your community in a public display of ritual.
Religion kept us together too. It's part of our life.
They could be poor, but they had clothes to go visit their grandparents, their relatives, and to come to church with. They would never come to church shabbily dressed, which was a very beautiful tradition. It was a sign of respect of who they were.
Well, we are on College Street, I would say the epicenter of Little Italy, College and Grace. This, in the 1970s, it was extremely Italian. Everything about it was Italian. All the shops were Italian, the schools were, largely Italian, full of Italian children.
Growing up as a teenager on College Street, we'd all hang out on the corner and just, hang out just for hours and hours, just talking, bantering. There's my dad actually in the picture there. He's in the picture, in front of the church.
The pylon used to be where the Royal is now, and the Studio Theatre used to be about a block further up. And they always showed Italian films.
This man I do remember on College Street. He was one of those guys.
Every day.
Yeah, you'd see him all the time. He was one of the characters on the street. We knew his sons. He had a store down right next to the church at one time. Yeah, my parents knew him. Yeah, they went to Our Lady of Fatima with him, the shrine, so they know him well.
At that time, I felt people were more connected to what was genuine. They were more connected to the things that mattered in life, the family, loving your children, bringing up your kids, keeping the connection to Italy through your relatives, and keeping flames alive.
It used to be a time that we would only eat homemade food because that was the closest to home.
Sundays we always had lasagna. Sundays was the occasion for a great, large family gathering, and she would cook this lasagna for the whole family. That became a kind of a traditional ritual for us.
The people with these strong rural traditions, many people who are following this program will have been raised in a home where behind the home there was this wonderful orto, the great garden with the peppers and the tomatoes and the garlic, and it still exists to this day.
A typical backyard back in growing up down there. So you'd see in every inch being used for vegetables, the clothes being hung up, which you don't really see anymore. And it's funny because we joke with our friends. We never realized that broken hockey sticks were used for anything but fixing tomatoes or setting up tomatoes. So.
It's natural that nonno grows the tomatoes and onions and lettuce, everything in the garden.
This is a typical scene, come October, with all my cousins and uncles down on Palmerston Street. That's a very typical basement shot. Everyone making the wine and that smell. I distinctly remember all those empty cases out on the streets. Every house had a stack of empty crates. But yeah, I do remember that in the basement there for a few days.
At that time, I would say every single family canned lots of tomatoes and made tomato sauce for the winter. They made their own wine. They also made their own salami and prosciuttos and sausages. They would cure them and sort of for the winter months. Very much like they would in Italy in those rural villages.
I mean, you do it because it's a tradition mostly, because if you really think about it, I don't know if it's convenient money-wise. You know what I mean?
And this kind of cucina povera that immigrants brought with them in the melanzana sandwiches to school, the eggplant sandwiches to school, and the very, very basic things was almost a source of embarrassment then.
It was a time when Toronto was really full of things like fish and chip shops.
I come from a family my father was a barber. We lived above the barber shop. My wife and I were married in 1985. As the business grew downstairs, our home grew upstairs, and our children as well. We now have 4 children who have been raised above a restaurant.
The pictures are about a time in Toronto when it wasn't so chic to be Italian.
You always felt marginal. You felt that that you were somehow less important than something else going on in some bigger world, some more mainstream world, the world of the non-Italian, the world of the non-immigrant.
You know, I always laugh at when I go to restaurants and see things like a frittata. Well, a frittata, or a frittata, as you would say in Italian, it really is a fried egg.
In the pictures of the nonnas, I mean, you can see the old ladies, they're dressed in black, they're in a corner, they're taking care of children, they're earning their keep. He had the nonnas and the children around him. His nonna was living with him, and it was a big part of his life.
That in most of the houses, you find first, second, and third generation, nonnas, mamas, and children and grandchildren living in the same house.
My parents raised my girls.
Living in this heart of Little Italy, coming to church gave them a sense of belonging and also gave them security and also gave them some sort of, yes, we are at home here, we are at home. And they didn't need to venture regarding learning language and stuff like that.
When I was in public school, the teachers named all the boys Joe and all the girls were Maria. So my name was Maria until I reached high school. And I realized my name wasn't Maria, but I thought it was because we were all called Maria G, Maria N, Maria S. But the teachers couldn't wrap their tongues around our names. They were so complicated. It seemed like Nina was just beyond their comprehension.
Oh no, nobody spoke English when we came here. We had to learn. We still don't speak English. I mean, some of us.
You know what? I think you know, our experience is probably no different than most of the young Italian Canadians. I mean, it was, you were there to translate. You were a young kid, but you're part lawyer at the same time. And if you didn't understand something that was coming from the school or some document that came in, we'd always hear from our parents, you know, what in the world did we send you to school for?
We needed people to translate for us. Mind you, most of the construction workers, they were Italians, so they didn't have problem.
I remember coming to some of these factories to translate sometimes for relatives of mine who were arriving from Italy, and they needed help in filling in a form, an application form. I remember doing that a couple of times.
There was a definite sense for me growing up of this double world that I lived in. You know, one was the Italian world, and one was the world outside, and we were sort of emissaries between the two. The new generation, because my mother only really learned English about maybe 15 years ago. She did a literacy program, but until then, she couldn't really have a conversation in English. I mean, there were points in my life when I could barely speak to my mother because I was, you know, trying to get past my Italian roots and didn't want to speak dialect, and she didn't speak English.
It shows a species that doesn't exist anymore, which is La Famiglia. The Famiglia doesn't exist the way it used to exist in the 50s, 60s, and even 70s.
You know what, we're to the point now where we don't understand each other, either we speak Sicilian English.
Parliamo siciliano. We do speak Sicilian.
Sometimes we talk to each other with his mind is there, my
dialect is much more class and more finesse in our own dialect, you know,
No,
which
no,
is
don't believe
Ragusa. No comparison with
He's always
Syracuse.
doing this.
I feel that people have been inviting me into their lives with my camera. As a photographer, I feel privileged that someone would ask me to take their picture. So it's really, you know, as a privilege, then I have a great responsibility. I've always tried to photograph as much as possible from within and not from outside, not being an outsider. You know, when you probably notice how pictures are taken with wide-angle lenses or normal lenses, short lenses. It's called normal, short lenses, as opposed to long zooms, because that means you're photographing from very close up. If you aren't honest, I think people, when you at that close distance, people will know that you're being dishonest, and they will close up. You might still take their picture, but they won't give you their soul. I think that the human face is probably the richest source of material, the human gestures that you can have visually, at least for me. And the moment you photograph someone, you're paying attention to them. And then when you publish that picture somewhere, you're paying even greater attention to them.
My life is in here too. Like with that cutting knife and everything, it shows so much of my life in it too. Construction, my mom, my dad's life and my brothers, they were all in construction, my husband too. What's in this book, it's part of our heritage in Canada, you know, what we went through.
A number of these pictures have been published over the years in different books and magazines and publications. At one point you become ready, and then the book finds its own way to be born, in a sense. But you have to have a combination of things. You have to have the right publisher, and you yourself have to be the right point in your life.
It's our 20th anniversary this year here at Grano, and Vincenzo, whom I've known for many, many years, I knew him by reputation and by his work even before we actually met. When he had the opportunity to launch this book, we did a launch party here for him. It was a sold-out, packed house.
The book to me is not so much about the working experience, but I think it's about nostalgia and that yearning. The book brings out that yearning for a more sincere past. You know, that border beyond Spadina College, Queen, and Grace. My God, you know, one day I discovered there was a library 2 blocks away. I had never gone 2 blocks from my house, but when I did, I discovered a whole world of literature. But nobody ever went beyond that little ghetto.
People have said to me that they have seen something of themselves, of their own experience, of having arrived in Canada as an immigrant, in search of work, in search of a dream, in search of a better life, in search of those streets that were supposed to have been paved with gold, and in fact, they weren't paved with gold.
So, you know, I think it speaks a lot to, you know, the sacrifices that our parents made, you know. They basically got off a boat, you know, and just worked hard and educated their kids. And
We need to have a record of that, you know, extinguished species, and here is the record. Vince made the record, and it came to us at the right time.
The idea of talking about the immigrant experience, something that people don't talk about that much, and something that maybe they don't see talked about on paper. I think that, in a sense, it sort of it validates for many people that kind of experience.
And it's funny, as a kid, you don't really realize it, but as you get older, you realize, as you go out in the world and you start working, that nobody would give them the breaks. They had to, you know, scratch and claw for everything. But they had this sort of inner fire in them that, you know, they were going to do it and they were going to make it, no matter what.
That's happened a few times now already, and people have said to me, you know, I'm not Italian, I didn't grow up Italian, and of course, you know, but this book has spoken to me also, speaks to me of my own experience of growing up in Canada.
When they bought these houses in this area, they were very, I'll say, not poor quality, but they were very, 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 what can I say? They weren't elegant, okay? But Italians came in and they put new verandas, they put basements in they got the basements were all out of sand and dirt. They put new basements in the home. They put kitchens down in the basement. They fixed the bedrooms. They put washrooms. In 1968, most of these homes still had wooden toilets with a plush, with a chain on it. I can remember so clearly, huh?
The cities evolve, and you can't have a city frozen in time.
That's the way these houses were. That's how this church was. It was 1900s, and we had to take the place and make it 1960. So it was all done by work. Now again, in those days, try to understand this. Pasquale was a carpenter. Michele was a plumber. So I fixed Pasquale's plumbing, Michele fixed my carpentry work.
I saw these changes happening. Of course, I couldn't predict the vastness of the change that was taking place, but it was right in front of my eyes. And this is a picture of my mother, who is running to embrace her sister, whom she hasn't seen for 25 years, because her sister had immigrated to Argentina. And my mother had immigrated to Canada instead, and so they met for the first time after 25 years in the airport in Toronto, which I always thought was kind of very fitting for the book, because Toronto, after all, means a place of meeting in the Huron language. Interesting also because my father, he worked in construction, so he worked in a number of different projects in the city, and one of them was when they were building the airport. It's the presence of people that give a place a meaning, because after all, who expresses that meaning but people?
We weren't poor, but we were rich in skills, and that's what kind of helped the Italians a lot. They came here knowing how to use cement, how to use rocks, how to use bricks, how to use nails, and they knew how to build. And this country needed to build, and they built. Thank you. Okay, we may have a lot of garlic smell and a lot of smelly bologna, smatadella sandwiches and broccoli, but we know how to build also, and we built a lot of work. Okay.
If you live in a place, then you know that you change the place changes you also.
Just look at this title here. I think he had a smart idea to put that it wasn't paved with gold. People would think that America was paved with gold, but it wasn't. You had to work for it.
It's not all about having wine and olives and good bread, you know. It's also about taking Prozac and not coping and not speaking the language and not being able to go to the bank because you can't speak the language.
So even while Vince was photographing Italian families and representing Italian workers and showing the dignity of Italians, he was also showing us families and culture and dignity that exists amongst all people everywhere.
These houses have actually seen many families of different nationalities.
My ancestors, like all Canadians virtually, except for Indigenous Canadians, in effect are immigrants. And I think that the closer you are to that reality, the more conscious you are of issues of self-respect and entitlement and dignity, as we've been saying. And I think that that may be ultimately the most important aspect of Vince's work. Most immigrant groups go through that stage where, you know, when they enter the new country, the new society, they're subjected to so much hardship and so many forms of rejection.
I always wanted my photographs to be socially relevant, and certainly I've tried. I've wanted to be able to use them in a way that was that had some relevance in the reality of life, as opposed to being completely divorced or cut off from it altogether.
We tend to think of them as people who sort of recreate some past culture, but that's not really what's happening. What's really happening is that they're creating a new culture to deal with this weird experience of immigration, this completely uprooting experience. Well, what happens when you're uprooted in that way? Well, you start to behave in certain kinds of ways. You recreate some things from home, you create new things, you adapt to your environment, you use what's available in your environment to somehow give you a sense of what you left behind, and you also move forward in all kinds of ways.
And I mean, I'm standing right now at a spot where I remember taking pictures back in 1973, I think it was, when they were building this building over here. They were actually getting ready to build the building, and we're looking, you know, this Bay Street behind me with the old City Hall, it's a symbol of Toronto. And when I think back, and this is the, you know, one of the points, one of the spots where people really started building this new city of theirs, and in a sense, making this country theirs. And they came as immigrants, but now they belong to Canada. Canada belongs to them.